Okay, hi, I'm Jim Cantrell. I'm the president, CEO, and co-founder of Phantom Space. I've been co-founder or on the founding teams of over 12 companies in total, mostly in space and automotive. I've had a career that spanned everywhere from NASA to the French Space Agency to a number of these commercial startups, including SpaceX. I was the guy that took Elon Musk to Russia to buy rockets. When that didn't work, we started SpaceX, and that was employee number four. I'm also an author. I've written two books. One is Breaking All the Rules, which is the story of how we started SpaceX. And then my next book, which is coming out by the end of the year, called 2 Hours Till Dawn, When Entrepreneurs Can Learn from Racing. So I'm also an appointed member of the Arizona Space Commission, and I've been in the space business for 35 years.
I'd like to first ask you what initially sparked your passion for space?
Well, I would go back far enough. It was watching the Apollo 11
Um,
astronauts walk on the moon back in 1969, and that was, an era that that was like almost a miracle to see that happen, and there
of
was sort of
course.
expectation that things would just continue to go like that. By the time I was, in college, we'd be on Mars and things. It didn't happen that way, but
Yeah.
so I rather lost my interest in space as a profession because of, the shuttle was interesting, but it wasn't as interesting as, going to the moon and going to Mars and so on. Then I got interested in space in college only because there was a NASA funded design course for a Mars mission
Oh,
that I
okay.
got involved with, and I pretty much had decided I was going to go work for one of the big automotive companies, but this happened, and it changed my life for the better or the worse, depending on how you want to look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, you've really had like a truly fascinating path. It's been through engineering, like government stuff and the French Space Agency. Like what were some of the early projects or experiences that shaped you how you think of the aerospace industry?
Well, I mean, there's things that shape how I think about it, good and bad, right? I would say the thing that sort of shaped my fascination with it was, this early Mars mission I worked on in France. It was a joint Soviet-French mission to Mars, and as I was growing up, the Soviet Union was, the threat that everybody says China is
Yeah.
today. And so we were all fascinated with the Soviets, and they were supposedly 13 foot tall and superhuman, and to actually see them and see that they were human beings, much like myself, was a real perspective changer, right? And then to work with them and see that they had, because of a lack of computers, a totally different way of approaching a problem was very interesting. And then I would say to the negative side was, my first job with NASA in the late '80s when nothing was happening, and we were spending all this money on doing nothing, and it was just this really negative experience for me. I mean, I worked with some great people that had done all these great missions to Mars, to Venus, to Mercury, and all these other places, and here we were unable to do anything because we had a space shuttle that wouldn't fly because it had an accident, and we didn't have any other rockets that would fly. It was very to me symbolic that we'd gone from Apollo to this, and so that's why I use the term orphan of Apollo.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a very unpleasant experience. And then, the positive really was SpaceX and beyond. We just, those of us who kind of felt the same way as I described about, being an orphan of Apollo, just wanted to do something, anything. And we wanted to do it in space. And then Elon came along and said, "Hey, I got this idea to go to Mars." And so a bunch of us piled onto that. So it was very positive in that, we felt like we could take our future into our own hands. We didn't have to wait for something called the government or they to go do it. It was something that, we could control, and that
Yeah.
was intoxicating, frankly. And we see how SpaceX turned out. I didn't last very long, but I got the bug to start other companies. So I left and started another 11 companies after that, mostly in space, a few automotive and related technology areas. But yeah, it's been a very interesting very interesting path, and I've seen a lot of it, change over the years.
Yeah, wait, so how exactly did you meet Elon Musk?
Mm. So he called me out of the blue in 2001. It was July, and he had been looking at doing something after he left PayPal to advance this idea of being a multiplanetary species. So he had come up with um, an idea that he and Robert Zubrin talked about, and Robert Zubrin was the founder of the Mars Society, and I knew Bob from professional endeavors, and they decided that, with the kind of money Elon would spend, he would just pay to do a mission to Mars himself, that they needed a Russian rocket. So that's when Bob said, "Hey, I know a guy." And I spent a number of years in Russia, post-Soviet Russia, helping convert ICBMs to satellite launchers. So that's how Elon came to my attention.
Okay, well, what were some of the biggest technical or strategy debates early on when building SpaceX?
The biggest one he and I had was whether or not to build everything ourselves. So the so-called vertical integration. Elon's idea was you had to build absolutely everything yourself. And my approach was different, that yeah, you want to build some things, but you don't want to build everything. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
It was more of a teaming kind of mentality. And in a sense, he was more right than I was, but I was not completely wrong either. Elon though had sort of an extreme view. I mean, he even wanted to go mine scandium to manufacture this special aluminum scandium alloy. So he asked me to go think about scandium mining, see if I could find out where the scandium was mined in the world, and go get our own mine. I mean, he was that extreme. So that, has been sort of a cornerstone of SpaceX, and I think 25 years ago that was correct. The other one was the size of the rocket, and we started with the small one, the Falcon 1, and that was really a practice rocket. We thought we the early SpaceX guys thought that that was our main rocket, and then we'd build a lot of them, and then surprise, surprise, Elon wants to build bigger rockets, and now we see Starship, which is so enormous. The only thing it's really efficient at is planetary settlement. It's really not an efficient
yeah,
commercial launch vehicle anymore. So that, those are really the two things. The idea of putting Starlink up was there in the very beginning. There was something called Teledesic that existed before SpaceX that was essentially Starlink, but it had failed to happen. They couldn't raise the kind of capital. So, we all understood that if we build our own launch vehicle, we could launch our satellites ourselves, not have to depend on somebody else, and to be able to do it at a much lower cost. So that was really the core strategy of the company.
yeah. So, in past interviews, I heard that you said that the industry thought you were crazy for some of your takes. So, how do you navigate through that skepticism back then?
Well, you just have to kind of have this sort of attitude, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Um, the people that said we were crazy, were thinking about different things than we were. They were worried about how they're going to feed their family, what kind of job security they had, what their retirement looked like. I was just not even thinking about stuff like that. I'll admit I thought a lot about how am I going to feed my children, but it didn't seem like that was an insurmountable problem to solve. It was more, that these things were important and we had to do them. But the rest of the people really kind of had a very traditional view of, well, the government's going to do it. They're going to do it. Not this, we're just going to take it and go do it attitude. And I think that's really very important to have in life, period. It doesn't matter whether it's aerospace or anything else.
yeah.
Take responsibility for yourself, and just go do whatever needs to be done.
Yeah. So after SpaceX, you built Vector and later Phantom Space, which both focused on democratizing access to space. So, what did you learn from Vector's journey that you applied to Phantom?
Yeah, so Vector ended up going bankrupt. It had a lot of successes, but in the end, was unsuccessful. And I think I learned three big lessons from that. One is your founders are extraordinarily important. So when you get involved with co-founders, and you can't do it by yourself, it's just too big of a job. You need multiple founders, two, three, four. In this case, we had four. Even though I knew these people for a long time, I chose poorly. I also chose my investors poorly. Not all of them, but several key investors were really not well aligned with what we were trying to do. They were, there because it seemed like a popular thing, and we were getting a lot of good press, and things seemed to have momentum. So you tend to get a lot of people that they call it riding your coattails. We had a lot of those kind of investors and those kind of employees. So when things got tough, the co-founders started fighting, and finger pointing was doing this, and then the key investor Sequoia pulled out because of a lot of reasons, but the public reason was they didn't like our fighting. And but the real reason was is their interests weren't aligned with what we are. So,
Mm.
that first lesson taught me that, in future endeavors, Phantom, you have to be very, 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 very careful about who you bring as co-founders. And you have to get rid of any co-founders if they turn out to be not well aligned or perfectly aligned. And same with investors, right? You have to be
Okay.
so careful bringing in the right investors, and their interests have to be aligned with yours. The second thing I learned was about money and the value, and I knew this, but I relearned it, the value of being very, very frugal. And so what you want to do with a group of engineers who really want to just spend everything. I mean, if they see a big pot of money, in their mind, you can substitute progress with spending money, and that doesn't work. So frugality is very key because that early capital you raise from investors is so expensive. If you let's just imagine if you build a $2 billion company and you raise $100 million to do it, that first $1 million could be worth, $200 million later when you're a multi-billion-dollar company. That's a very expensive capital, right? So you have to be very, very good stewards of that and not spend it. So I always said you had to wait until the last second of the last hour of the last day when somebody told you needed something, and then wait another 30 days. And a lot of times engineers would figure out they don't need it. Um, and then the third thing I would say I learned was that you have to face problems today and not think about them or wait until later. You have to take responsibility and take action immediately. You can't wait. And that there were several people that we should have gotten out of the company that we didn't earlier. And so by the time it, got to the point where we got rid of them, it was way, way late. So, it applies to other things, if something needs to be done. And we should have reshuffled the company very early. So we applied that to Phantom. We've done much better at Phantom.
Yeah.
Been in business 6 years. I think Vector was in business a total of three. We've raised quite a bit of money. We've only spent about 45 million so far. Within 3 years, we spent 100 million at Vector, and we've made it further here at Phantom than we did at Vector on less money. And we're a small team, and we are very like-minded in the team. Again, back to that, the people are everything um, lesson, and we're just very frugal. So yeah, we're
Yeah.
walking the walk.
So, what does Henry Ford of space mean? It's one of Phantom Space's visions. Exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so if you go back 120 years when Ford envisioned the Model T, he was thinking of building a product for a world where nobody could afford that product. It was in a time when cars would cost $8,000 and then your dollars, and that's more, 4 or 5 times more than a house would cost. And so Henry Ford had the radical idea that he would build a car that the average person who had a factory salary could afford. And so we're replicating that at Phantom to overcome the capital and technical know-how barriers to getting space activities going, to creating value in space by transforming space from this capex heavy hardware centric industry to a digital centric industry. And we're
Okay.
doing that primarily with Phantom Cloud, which is our space-based data center network that that will backhaul satellite data and allow AI to be planted on these data centers to essentially bring the AI to the data rather than the AI to the data, and therefore creating a space data app store where, like your mobile phone, users can create apps that access this spaceborne data and creates value in ways none of us have thought about today. But we have to build our own launch vehicle and our own satellites to do that, much in the same playbook as SpaceX.
Okay, so are there any like speaking of startups, are there any underrated opportunities or areas in aerospace that might that like there's big white spaces that you think startups might be successful in at the moment?
Well, so the demand for launch is off the charts. There's sort of this narrative that's incorrect that there's a lot of these launch companies, there's too much competition, and blah blah blah. And the truth is, there's not enough launch capacity, and the demand is growing faster than the capacity is growing, so it's getting worse. But that is a very talent barrier centric industry, so the talent barriers are very high. There's not many people in the world that can make those things work. They're very unforgiving, kind of like a Formula One car is unforgiving of people who don't know them. And then the other side of it is that uh, that there's a lot of capital required. Even though we've been able to get a rocket this far along for a whole lot less than $100 million, there's most people think that it takes 500 million to $1 billion. So there's only a few people that can really do it for that cheap. The other side on aerospace satellites, there just isn't a supply chain in the U.S. For satellite components, and there's really a growing demand on that. And the supply chain in the U.S. has been bought up and changed and so on. It's just not there, and a lot of it's migrated to Europe. So there's a huge demand for U.S. based supply chain and satellites.
Okay, so when you evaluate some of these early stage startups in the industry, what are you looking for to kind of know if they're going to make it for the next couple of years?
First thing I look for is the team, the quality of the team. Um, this is not for the faint of heart, startups. It's
Mhm.
something you have to be very dedicated to. You have to be the kind of person that never gives up. It's like racing cars. If you spin your car and go off the track and you throw your helmet down and say, I'm done, you're not going to finish the race. You're just going to sit there until the end of the race. And that's the same as a startup. And you will have failures as a startup founder, and none of those failures have to be fatal. Some of them are, but most of them aren't. And so you just have to get through that. And so you have to be that kind of, pig-headed, determined person that refuses to, despite name calling like we were at SpaceX, saying you're crazy, you're ruining your career, all these things. You got to be pretty headstrong and you know exactly what needs to be done. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I look for is an idea that seems to have some basis in reality. It doesn't have to be perfected at that point because a good team will change the idea to fit the realities of raising money and markets, right? But you have to start somewhere, with something reasonably sound. And that's a reflection of people's sound thinking as well. And then the third thing is, their ability to sell to customers, sell to investors. Life is a sales job, and you have to be good at it to be in this business.
So other than choosing the right group of people to have a startup with, what mistakes do you see a lot of aerospace entrepreneurs make when they're starting?
Biggest one I see is that they raise a lot of money and they mistake that for being successful.
Yeah.
And just because you have a lot of money in your bank does not make you successful. You need to have money. I don't care where you get your capital. You have to have it to run a negative cash flow for a number of years, which is very typical of aerospace startups. Uh, but don't mistake the fact you got the money for you've made it, right? It doesn't mean you're valuable, even though on paper it says you are. You have to get to cash flow positive. You have to have a product that works, and that's probably the biggest mistake they make. The second biggest mistake I think they make is going after the wrong investors. And again, going back to the lessons from Vector, if you don't have investors that are completely aligned with you, that's a problem. And in aerospace, the timelines are long, and the investment funds people have been raising out of aren't necessarily compatible with that. They have sometimes a 4 or 5 year timeline on payout and return to the people who've invested in that fund, whereas aerospace is looking at a 5 to 10 year. So there'll be some unreasonable pressures that can force early failures coming from the investor side if they're not careful.
Okay, so now for my last kind of question, I always like to end it with advice for some of these young leaders. Now, what advice would you give to a high schooler who wants to combine aerospace engineering and entrepreneurship, much like your own path?
Well, the first thing you have to do is find something you're passionate about. You go back to the work ethic and all that you need to have, which is kind of quality of the team. If you're going to work this much at something, you better really enjoy it. And the only way you really enjoy it is to be passionate about it. Some aspect, right? It doesn't really matter what it is, but you have to know what that passion is, and it has to drive you forward every morning. So there are many days you get up, trust me, you don't even want to get out of bed sometimes when you're doing this, you're either tired or burned out or facing problems you don't want to solve. And if you don't have that passion to drive you into it, you're just not going to be good. You're not going to be as good as the next guy that does. And then the second thing is to do find that product market fit. I call this making something that somebody wants to buy, right? For which there's demand. And that's a place where a lot of entrepreneurs go wrong. They think, sometimes they're way early. Sometimes they just have wacky ideas. And then sometimes they can really get it right, and I've been accused of being somebody can see the future. Maybe not. Steve Jobs clearly was. He, saw a need for these things that we didn't know we needed, right?
Mhm.
So there's a kind of a magic sometimes there, but again, the end result is you have to build something that people want to buy. And then the third part is you have to be good at it. And this is something that's kind of funny, but I've seen entrepreneurs who have one and two, but they're really not good at it. And it doesn't matter how passionate you are about making something real. If you're just not good at it, then you're probably not the right person for it. But sometimes those things can be learned. Sometimes you can bring in